In the spring of 1838, deep in the humid heart of Natchez, Mississippi, a planter made a decision so obscene that even the cruelest masters whispered about it in secret. He gave his only daughter, an overweight, unmarried heir of 27, over to the enslaved, not for care, not for discipline, but for ownership. Within months, Magnolia Reach plantation was ash. Bodies vanished, and the name Darrington was struck from county records as if it had never existed. Tonight, we unearth the unholy arrangement of the planter's overweight heir, a shame white society buried. It's a story of power, humiliation, and vengeance in a world built on chains and sin. Behind the manicured gardens and grand parlors of Mississippi's elite stood a family that made a pact with darkness, one that turned their plantation into a monument to madness and revenge. What happened after that unholy exchange still haunts the soil of Natchez to this day. Before we begin this descent into one of the Deep South's most disturbing secrets, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record channel and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the stories that history tried to silence. And tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Your city, your state, your country? Because these forgotten voices deserve to be heard again. Now, let's go back to where it began. The year was 1838. Natchez, Mississippi, pulsed with the wealth of cotton and the stench of blood. The great riverboats drifted past mansions built on misery. Magnolia Reach sat just beyond the city's edge, a plantation of wide porches, black iron balconies, and endless fields of white gold swaying under the heat. It looked like paradise to those who never saw its bones. Gideon Darrington was the master of Magnolia Reach, a tall, lean man whose charm masked rot beneath the surface. He wasn't the richest planter in Adams County, but he wanted to be. He spent his evenings drinking bourbon with men who whispered about blood oaths and prosperity rituals. To his peers he was respectable, a man with vision. But in truth, he was a desperate gambler, buried in debt and fear. His daughter, Eleanor Darrington, was his shame. 27 years old, weighing near 270 pounds, confined to her rooms for years. She was called the sickly one, the heiress no man would marry, the child who screamed in her sleep and talked of things best forgotten. Gideon told the town she was afflicted by female disorders, but those who worked in the house whispered that she was cursed, that she had seen something in the cellar when she was 12 and had never been right since. As dusk settled on Magnolia Reach, cicadas droned like fevered prayers. The house stood still, its windows shuttered against the coming storm. Inside, Eleanor sat by the cold hearth, staring at the reflection of candlelight in a cracked mirror, whispering a single phrase over and over. He promised they'd never come back. Outside, in his study, Gideon Darrington broke the wax seal on a letter marked with a black vine and crimson wax, a symbol that only a handful of men in the South would ever recognize. The Brotherhood of the Vine had written, and before the week ended, the fate of Magnolia Reach would be sealed in fire. The land around Natchez was beautiful in the way of places built on sorrow. The magnolia trees bloomed heavy and white, their sweetness masking the smell of sweat and rot that rose from the fields. The air shimmered with heat even before dawn, thick enough to choke a man. To outsiders, it was paradise. Cotton kingdoms, proud families, grand homes standing like monuments to civilization. But to those who labored unseen beneath that beauty, Mississippi was a graveyard where the soil drank blood faster than rain. Magnolia Reach was no different. 800 acres of rich bottomland, worked by nearly 60 enslaved people who moved like shadows through the mist. They cut, picked, and carried without pause, their backs bent under both labor and fear. Overseers rode the fields with pistols on their hips, while the Darrington name echoed through the region as a symbol of order and control. Gideon Darrington believed he had built an empire worthy of envy. In truth, his house was held together by debt, deceit, and a secret that had been festering for decades. He had inherited Magnolia Reach from his father, a man who preached God on Sundays and practiced cruelty every other day of the week. Gideon had grown up under the belief that power was something taken, not earned. His obsession wasn't wealth alone, it was belonging. He wanted to be part of the inner circle of men who shaped the South from behind locked doors, the planters, judges, and ministers who called themselves the Brotherhood of the Vine. They met in secrecy, claiming their rituals brought fortune and protection to their estates. Gideon believed them. He believed because he had seen the power they commanded, their influence, their reach, and because he had already given them too much of himself to ever walk away. By 1838, his gambling debts to the Brotherhood had reached $10,000, money he did not have and could not pay. His last harvest had failed after weeks of flooding, and he'd borrowed from the wrong men to keep up appearances. The Brotherhood didn't threaten in words. Their letters came sealed in wax, their consequences implied by silence. Men who failed them lost more than land. They disappeared from ledgers, from memory, from existence. But even as Gideon sat in his study surrounded by papers and worry, the house around him was rotting. The servants whispered that Magnolia Reach was cursed, that its walls groaned with the voices of the dead. Doors opened by themselves. Candles went out with no wind. Some said the ground beneath the main house was hollow, honeycombed with tunnels where something unholy had been buried long ago. At night, Gideon would sometimes hear Eleanor's voice echoing through the halls, soft, broken laughter that turned to weeping. He told himself she was mad, that her sickness was punishment for her mother's weak constitution. But deep down, Gideon knew the truth. His daughter's mind had broken not from illness, but from what she had seen one humid night when she followed him into the cellar. That was 16 years ago. Since then, no one had been allowed below the main floor after dark. Now, as thunder rolled across the river, Gideon poured a glass of bourbon, staring at the candlelight trembling on the wine-colored wax seal. The letter on his desk bore no return name, only the sigil of the Vine and a message that would force him to choose between ruin and something far worse. The Brotherhood of the Vine was calling in its debt. Eleanor Darrington had been born into privilege and isolation. Her mother, Rebecca, died in childbirth, leaving Gideon alone with a child he neither wanted nor knew how to love. He hired governesses and tutors, but they never lasted. Some left quietly, others fled in the night. The girl they described was intelligent, moody, and prone to strange fits. At 12, she began speaking of things no child should know. Whispers in the walls, footsteps below her floor, and laughter that came from the cellar when no one was there. By 27, Eleanor had become a prisoner in her own home. The years had not been kind. Her once pretty face was swollen and pale, her body heavy from the tonics and opium-laced treatments prescribed by a parade of doctors. They called it hysteria, female disorder, melancholia, whatever word allowed them to bleed her, drug her, and bill her father. She was fed mercury for cleansing, laudanum for rest, and sugar for silence. The combination left her sluggish, trembling, and unable to focus for more than minutes at a time. Gideon insisted she stay upstairs, away from visitors. For her own dignity, he would say, though everyone knew it was his reputation he wanted to protect. To the people of Natchez, Eleanor was a curiosity, a ghostly figure glimpsed at windows, a rumour wrapped in silk and shame. The wives of neighbouring planters gossiped about her over tea. Poor Miss Darrington, they said. So young, so ill, so very unfortunate. But the enslaved people who worked the house whispered another version, the pastor. They said the girl wasn't mad at all. They said she had seen what Gideon did in the cellar all those years ago, and the knowledge had burned itself into her mind. On some nights, when the air was heavy and still, Eleanor would rise from her bed and pace the hallway barefoot, muttering to herself. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight. Servants would peek from behind door frames as she drifted past, her nightgown clinging to her like mist. She would stop by the window overlooking the fields and whisper names no one recognized. When she spoke of her father, it was never as father. She called him the keeper. The only person she tolerated was Judith, an older house servant who had tended her since infancy. Judith would brush her tangled hair, clean the sweat from her face, and listen when Eleanor spoke of things buried in darkness. It wasn't sickness that started this, Eleanor once told her. It was a night of celebration. They said they were blessing the land, but the ground screamed. I heard it. Judith had shushed her, fearing Gideon might overhear. Still, not all her madness was invention. Something inside Eleanor was unraveling, but beneath the confusion was an intelligence that refused to die. She kept notes, scribbled pages of thoughts she hid under her floorboards, sentences about symbols she had seen carved into the cellar walls, names she didn't understand, and a recurring phrase she couldn't forget. The vine must feed. In the spring of 1838, Eleanor's condition worsened. She refused her medicine. She threw her glass against the mirror and screamed when she saw her own reflection. Gideon summoned another physician from New Orleans, who left after a single day, declaring her case beyond reason. The doctor's carriage had barely cleared the gate when Gideon, his face grey with exhaustion and fury, poured himself a drink and muttered, "Then reason will no longer be required." That night, he took out the letter from the Brotherhood again and read it under the trembling glow of a single candle. It promised salvation from debt, protection from ruin, but at a cost that no man should ever consider. Gideon's hand trembled as he folded the letter. Upstairs, Eleanor's laughter echoed through the house, wild and broken. It sounded like the voice of someone who already knew what decision her father was about to make. The Brotherhood of the Vine had no church, no courthouse, and no written charter. It existed in whispers, passed from one generation of planters to the next like a family disease. Its members claimed to be men of reason, enlightened gentlemen who believed prosperity came to those willing to honor the land through sacrifice. But behind the polished manners and Latin mottos lay something ancient and predatory. They gathered not to worship, but to feed, on fear, on flesh, on the illusion of control over death itself. Gideon Darrington had joined them 19 years earlier, long before the sickness took root in his daughter. He had been young then, ambitious, eager to prove himself among men who could make or break a fortune with a single handshake. His initiation had taken place in the cellar of a plantation outside Vicksburg. 13 men stood in a circle around a stone basin filled with something thick and dark. He had expected ritual, theatre, a show of old-world symbolism. What he witnessed instead had haunted him every night since. The Brotherhood believed blood bound the land to its owners, that only through offering could prosperity continue. Gideon told himself it was metaphor, but deep down he knew better. For years, his association with them brought wealth and influence. His crops thrived, his business flourished, and his reputation climbed. But prosperity, like all things the Brotherhood promised, came with a timer. One favor led to another, and soon Gideon found himself owing money, first to one brother, then another. When the markets turned and the cotton prices fell, those debts became chains he couldn't break. By 1838, the Brotherhood decided his usefulness outweighed his solvency. They wanted proof of loyalty, something that would humiliate him so completely that he'd never dream of turning against them. The letter arrived sealed in red wax pressed with their vine sigil, a twisting root pattern coiled around a chalice. It contained only 3 paragraphs, written in neat, deliberate script. The words were polite, even compassionate, but their meaning was cruel beyond measure. They reminded him of his debt, $10,000 owed to the Brotherhood for investments and accommodations. They acknowledged his failing crops, his social standing, and his burden of a daughter. And then came the condition. To restore balance and faith, you will make a public declaration that your daughter, Miss Eleanor Darrington, is to be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man of our choosing. The act will symbolize the transference of the weak to the strong, the surrender of pride to power. This will be your tithe. Complete this act, and your debt is forgiven. Refuse, and you will lose everything. The letter was unsigned. It didn't need to be. For 3 nights, Gideon didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the candlelight dancing across his ledgers. To defy the Brotherhood meant ruin, foreclosure, disgrace, perhaps death. But to obey meant public humiliation, a scandal that would destroy his family name forever. Still, the Brotherhood had left no room for negotiation. His ruin was already written. This was the only way to rewrite it. By the 4th night, his bourbon glass lay empty beside him, the wax from his candle pooling like blood across his desk. He took up his pen with a shaking hand and scrawled his reply. I accept the terms. The transference shall take place before witnesses. May the vine be satisfied. He sealed it in black wax, pressed the family crest into it, and handed it to his overseer at dawn. That morning, Magnolia Reach was unnaturally still. The slaves who worked the yard said the birds refused to sing. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, though the sky was clear. Gideon Darrington had just sold his soul for silence. The letter that sealed Gideon Darrington's fate arrived on the morning of April 2nd, 1838. It was delivered by a rider in a grey coat who refused to give his name. The man dismounted, handed Gideon the letter without a word, and rode away before a servant could even offer water. The envelope was thick, the seal dark crimson, the vine emblem pressed deep into wax. The scent of iron and smoke clung to it, as if it had been carried straight from a forge. Gideon waited until he was alone in his study before breaking it open. Inside were 3 pages written in precise, careful script. The first detailed his arrears, $10,000 owed, interest compounding monthly, due upon demand. The second page outlined the terms of his absolution. It spoke of balance, sacrifice, and the restoration of fortune through symbolic inversion. The third page contained instructions. On the evening of April 20th, in front of selected witnesses, he was to announce that his daughter, Miss Eleanor Darrington, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man chosen by the Brotherhood. For 1 year, this man would have total control of her household, her person, and her treatment. Gideon was to present this act as an experimental cure for her condition, a desperate father's final attempt to save his daughter. If he complied, his debt would be erased. If he refused, the Brotherhood would claim Magnolia Reach, his fortune and his name. There would be no second letter. Gideon read the pages 3 times. The first time as a businessman calculating risk, the second as a father weighing shame, and the third as a man who understood damnation when he saw it. He poured himself a drink and stared at the brandy's amber swirl. Eleanor's laughter drifted faintly from upstairs, unhinged, exhausted, echoing through the walls. He clenched his fist until the glass cracked in his palm. For hours he sat unmoving, the candle burning low, shadows crawling across the walls like vines. By midnight, he decided there was no choice left. Men like him didn't surrender. They adapted. If the Brotherhood wanted spectacle, he would give them one. And if his daughter had to be humiliated for his debts to be cleared, then so be it. In Gideon's world, love had never been part of the bargain. He reached for paper, dipped his pen in ink, and began to write his reply. The nib scratched slow and steady against the parchment. To the Brotherhood of the Vine, I acknowledge your terms and accept the duty imposed. The demonstration shall occur on the 20th of April, witnessed by men of station and faith. The man selected for her care shall be given full authority as required. May the vine be appeased and the harvest be restored. He sanded the ink, folded the page, and pressed his family seal into the cooling wax. Then he held it up to the candlelight, studying the imprint of the Darrington crest, an oak tree encircled by a serpent devouring its own tail. For the first time in his life, Gideon thought it looked less like a symbol of legacy and more like a warning. He summoned his overseer, Calvin Rourke, a brute of a man with a scar from ear to jaw. "Take this to Mr. Fenton in Natchez," Gideon ordered. "He'll see it delivered." Rourke hesitated. "Is it Brotherhood business, sir?" Gideon's eyes hardened. "You didn't hear that word. You never will." When Rourke rode it, into the night, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain, or perhaps smoke. Gideon leaned back in his chair and stared into the dark window pane. His reflection looked back at him hollow-eyed and tired. He whispered to it, "It's only 1 year." Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Eleanor's voice, faint and trembling, drifted through the ceiling. "You can't trade what isn't yours." Gideon froze. For a moment he could swear she was standing just beyond his door. When he opened it, the hall was empty, only candlelight flickering along the wallpaper like veins of blood. He closed the door, locked it, and whispered to himself, "It will all be over soon." Outside, thunder rolled across the river, but no rain fell. The man chosen by the Brotherhood arrived at Magnolia Reach on April the 13th, 1838. His name was Isaiah Cole, a 32-year-old enslaved carpenter from Virginia. He had the bearing of someone who measured every word before speaking it, a quiet confidence that unsettled anyone who tried to read him. When the wagon stopped at the front steps, Gideon Darrington came out to greet him, coat immaculate, expression composed, though the faint tremor in his hand betrayed the unease beneath. Isaiah sat in the wagon bed, wrists unbound, eyes steady. Most enslaved men avoided direct eye contact. It could earn a beating or worse, but Isaiah looked straight at Gideon, unflinching. His gaze wasn't defiant, but it wasn't submissive either. It was the look of a man who had already seen the worst of the world and found nothing left to fear. "You're the one they sent?" Gideon asked. "Yes, sir," Isaiah replied, his voice deep, deliberate. The overseer Rourke stood a few paces behind, arms folded. "Quiet one," he muttered. "Kept to himself the whole trip. Didn't ask for food, didn't ask for water." Gideon's eyes swept over the papers the trader had delivered. A bill of sale from an intermediary plantation, marked with the Brotherhood's sigil. One enslaved male, age 32, carpenter and herbal practitioner, temperament, calm, intelligent. Gideon didn't like the last word. Intelligent men were dangerous. "You understand why you're here?" Gideon asked. "I was told you have a daughter needs tending," Isaiah said evenly. "They said my hands were good for mending things, broken things." Something in the phrasing made Gideon pause. He nodded slowly. "You'll see to her needs and follow every instruction I give. Speak only when spoken to. You're not a doctor. You're not a man of medicine. You're here because your methods amuse my associates. Understood?" Isaiah lowered his head, though not fully. "Understood, sir." He was given a small cabin behind the main house, separate from the others. Inside he found a cot, a table, and a single candle. The room smelled faintly of cedar and damp earth. When the door closed, Isaiah sat down and exhaled. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were 3 folded slips of paper, worn soft from years of handling. Each bore a name written in a child's clumsy hand. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, his wife, and children. He had carried those scraps for 4 years, ever since they were sold away to a plantation in Alabama known for working people to death. The man who signed the sale was Gideon Darrington. He'd done it not out of need, but to prove his strength to the Brotherhood. A man who could separate a family without hesitation, they said, was fit to join their ranks. Isaiah had learned of it by chance, from a field hand who overheard the trade. His wife had died of fever within months. His son was crushed in the gin press. His daughter stopped eating and died quietly one night. He spent years plotting his way south, intentionally getting sold from one plantation to the next. Each move brought him closer to Magnolia Reach, closer to the man who had destroyed his life. When the Brotherhood selected him for this assignment, Isaiah understood it wasn't coincidence. They thought they were choosing a man without will, someone docile enough to serve their purpose. But fate, or something darker, had chosen otherwise. He unfolded the paper with the names one more time, smoothing it carefully with his fingers. "You'll see justice," he whispered. "I swear it." Then he blew out the candle and sat in the dark, listening to the insects scream outside. The wind moved through the cypress trees like a sigh, and for the first time since his arrival, he smiled, a small, grim curve of his lips. By morning, the house would awaken to a new order. By nightfall, the Darrington bloodline would begin its quiet unraveling. The dawn that welcomed Isaiah Cole to Magnolia Reach broke heavy and grey, the kind of morning when sound travelled strangely and every breath carried the taste of rain. The plantation yard stirred slowly to life. Field hands moved like silhouettes through mist rising from the wet grass, their songs muted, their steps cautious. Word had already spread. Master Darrington had brought in a new man, one who wasn't meant for the fields, a man with strange eyes and stranger purpose. When the wagon came to a stop in front of the main house, the servants pretended not to look, but every window curtain twitched. The women in the kitchen whispered that this was no ordinary slave, that he'd come by way of people even the overseer feared to name. One claimed he'd seen the trader cross himself before handing Gideon the papers, muttering about unnatural bargains. Gideon stepped onto the porch, boots polished, coat immaculate, the picture of control. But his jaw tightened as Isaiah climbed down from the wagon and stood on the packed earth before him. The difference between them, one dressed in linen and pride, the other in coarse cloth and silence, was the distance between worlds. And yet for a brief moment, Gideon felt smaller. Rourke the overseer spat into the dirt beside them. "We're putting him with the quarters, sir." "No," Gideon said. "He'll stay near the house. He's to have his own cabin. His duties concern the mistress upstairs, and only her." That statement hung in the air like smoke. Even Rourke's expression faltered. Gideon did, and explain. He didn't have to. Everyone on the plantation knew better than to question the master's orders, especially when those orders came whispered from the Brotherhood. Isaiah nodded once, saying nothing. Gideon gestured for a house servant to lead him to the cabin. The path wound through the edge of the magnolia grove to a small clearing behind the main house. The cabin was modest but sturdier than the others. New wood, a table, a small bed, a single narrow window. When he was alone, Isaiah placed his small bundle of belongings on the table. From inside his shirt, he drew the folded piece of paper bearing his family's names and placed it beside a tiny wooden cross he had carved from a cedar branch years ago. He traced the names with one finger, whispering under his breath, "This is where it ends." He walked to the window and looked toward the great house. It loomed through the trees, pale and immense, a sleeping giant with a soul black as tar. From somewhere inside, faint music drifted. Eleanor's piano played haltingly, a single melody repeating again and again like a prayer she'd forgotten the words to. Down by the fields, a bell rang, calling the labourers to work. The day began, ordinary in every visible way, but Isaiah knew something had shifted. The air itself felt different, heavy with expectation. He stepped outside and walked toward the back entrance of the house, where the kitchen slaves moved in hurried silence. They parted instinctively when he passed, unsure if they should meet his eyes or bow their heads. Judith, the grey-haired servant who tended Eleanor, stopped him at the steps. Her voice was low but sharp. "You're the one they brought for her?" "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah said softly. She studied him for a long moment. "Then may God help you. Ain't no medicine that can heal what's wrong in that house." He gave a single nod and continued up the stairs. The door closed behind him, shutting out the sounds of the fields. Inside, the air smelled of candle smoke, perfume, and something sweet that had gone sour. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down from all sides. The history, the silence, the secrets. Upstairs, beyond that silence, a woman stirred. And somewhere between her sickness and his vengeance, both of their fates were waiting. The first meeting between Isaiah Cole and Eleanor Darrington took place on the morning of April the 14th, 1838, a morning so still the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Judith, the house servant, led him up the wide staircase, her steps hesitant on the runner worn thin by decades of footsteps. The hall smelled faintly of laudanum and lavender water, that heavy sweetness of sickness dressed as civility. Judith stopped outside a closed door at the far end of the corridor. The wood was scarred from thrown objects, the brass handle dented. She knocked lightly. "Miss Eleanor, there's someone here to help with your treatments." From behind the door came a muffled crash, glass shattering against the wall. Then a voice. Titu, hick and slurred. "I told you, I don't want another doctor. Send him away." Judith gave Isaiah a weary look. "She's been worse these past days. Don't take it personal." No one lasts long in that room. Isaiah nodded once and pushed the door open. Judith hesitated, but he closed it behind him before she could follow. The air inside was dense, stale, filled with the smell of opium, spoiled food, and something metallic beneath it. Curtains were drawn tight, blocking the light. Piles of books and clothes littered the floor. A mirror hung crooked above the fireplace, its glass fractured into a spiderweb of reflections. In a chair near the cold hearth sat Eleanor Darrington, wrapped in a faded silk dressing gown, her hair dishevelled, her face pale and swollen. Her eyes, once blue, had taken on a glassy, fevered sheen. She looked up, blinking as if unsure whether the figure before her was real. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Another charlatan? Another man who claims to cure me with powders and prayers?" Isaiah remained by the door, hands clasped before him. "No, ma'am, I'm not a doctor." "Then why are you here?" He stepped forward, slow, measured. "Your father says you're unwell. He asked that I care for you." Her laugh was sharp, unhinged. "Care? That's what they call it now. You'll lock me in, dose me until I can't speak, and call it kindness. They all say the same." She reached for the bottle on the table beside her, hand shaking, and poured laudanum into a cup of cold tea. "This is care," she said, raising it toward her lips. Isaiah crossed the room and caught her wrist gently but firmly. "No, ma'am," he said. "That's poison." Her eyes widened, confusion flashing into anger. "Unhand me," she hissed. He released her slowly and walked to the window. With one strong pull, he yanked the heavy curtains open. Sunlight exploded into the room, blinding after so many months of shadow. Eleanor cried out, covering her face with her hands. "Stop! Close it! I can't—" "When's the last time you saw daylight, Miss Darrington?" he asked quietly. "None of your concern." He studied her a moment. "You're not sick from your mind. You're sick from what they've been feeding you. Laudanum, mercury, powders that eat you from the inside. I've seen it before." Her hands lowered slowly, eyes narrowing. "And what would you know about that?" "My grandmother was a healer," Isaiah said. "She taught me things no doctor would write down. How to pull poison from the body. How to make the blood remember its strength." She stared at him, caught between fear and fascination. "My father sent you," she said finally. "You're part of his punishment." He met her gaze evenly. "Maybe I'm here for another reason." Something flickered across her expression then, a flash of curiosity piercing the fog of madness. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the faintest pulse of clarity. Isaiah turned toward the door. I'll be back before dusk. You'll eat a proper meal, and you'll take nothing unless I give it to you." She almost laughed at the audacity. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll keep dying," he said simply, and left her to the room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Eleanor staring at the light now streaming across the floor. For the first time in months, the house felt less like a tomb and more like something waking up. The next 3 days at Magnolia Reach were a kind of quiet battle between life and death. Eleanor Darrington's body, bloated and brittle from years of chemical imprisonment, began to revolt against its poisons. Isaiah Cole started by locking away her laudanum and mercury tonics, replacing them with tinctures of valerian, milk thistle, and willow bark. The doctors would have called it witchcraft. To Isaiah, it was medicine older than their science, carried from people who had healed themselves without permission. The first day, Eleanor screamed for the drug. She clawed at the sheets, cursed him, demanded her medicine. Isaiah sat in the chair by her bedside, speaking rarely, watching her body tremble through the fevers. When she thrashed, he held her shoulders gently but firmly. When she wept, he wiped her face with a damp cloth and whispered, "It will pass, miss. Let the sickness leave you." By the second night, she had stopped calling for her father and begun calling for her mother, whom she barely remembered. Her voice came in broken whispers. "She sang to me once," she murmured, eyes glassy, "before he took her away." Isaiah didn't answer. He knew grief better than most men knew scripture. He sat in silence until her breathing steadied. By dawn of the third day, the fever broke. Eleanor lay drenched in sweat, hair plastered to her face, lips pale but calm. The tremor that had haunted her hands for years was gone. When she opened her eyes, the fog that had clouded them seemed to have lifted. Isaiah brought her water mixed with honey and herbs. "Drink," he said. She obeyed, her hand trembling only slightly. "How long was I asleep?" 2 days. Maybe more." Her eyes darted toward the window, where sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains. "I dreamed," she whispered, "of voices in the dark, men chanting, the smell of iron and smoke." He studied her. "You've dreamed that before?" "Since I was a girl." She swallowed hard. "But they weren't dreams then. I saw it." Isaiah leaned forward slightly. "Saw what?" She turned her head toward him, her expression hollow. "The cellar. My father and his friends. I followed them one night when I was 12. They said it was a harvest ritual. They wore robes. There was a woman on a table, alive. I remember the sound she made when they cut her. I remember my father holding the knife." She stopped, trembling. Isaiah said nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was sometimes the only kindness left. "I tried to tell people," she continued. "He said I was hysterical. They all believed him. They fed me poisons until I forgot what I'd seen. Or tried to." Her voice hardened. "But I didn't forget. I remember every scream." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Isaiah's jaw clenched, but his voice remained even. "You've carried that truth alone a long time." She nodded weakly. "And you? Why do you look at him like you already hate him?" Isaiah hesitated. The truth was too sharp to speak plainly. "Because your father has done terrible things. To others. To mine." "Elias." Nor's eyes locked onto his. "Then maybe," she whispered, "we can help each other." He stood, collecting the basin and cloth. "Rest, miss. You'll need strength for what's coming." When he left the room, Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window. The sun had climbed higher, spilling light across the walls. For the first time since childhood, she saw the world not as a haze of pain, but as something real. It frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her. Downstairs, Isaiah emptied the basin into the earth outside the kitchen door, watching the dirty water soak into the soil. "Let the poison leave her," he murmured. The magnolia branches creaked overhead, whispering in the wind. Somewhere deep beneath the house, something old shifted, as if the land itself had begun to stir. By the evening of April 18th, Eleanor Darrington was sitting upright for the first time in years. Her colour had returned, still pale, but alive. Her eyes, once clouded by laudanum and despair, now burned with a lucid awareness that unsettled everyone around her. Judith brought her broth and bread, and when she left the tray, Eleanor touched her hand gently. "Thank you," she said with startling clarity. The old servant froze for a heartbeat, eyes wide, before nodding silently and leaving the room. Downstairs she crossed herself. "The girl's waking up," she whispered, "and the house won't rest easy for it." That night, Isaiah sat in the chair by the open window, the smell of magnolia drifting through the damp air. Eleanor watched him from her bed. Her voice was steady but quiet. "You meant what you said before, didn't you? About my father poisoning me?" Isaiah nodded. "Mercury and laudanum can dull the mind, weaken the heart, keep a body dependent. They're tools for silence." "And you think he wanted me silent?" she asked. "I think he needed you silent," Isaiah said, "because you saw something he couldn't afford to let the world believe." She was quiet a long while. When she finally spoke, her words were slow and deliberate. "I remember her. The woman on the table. They said she was a thief. They said she'd stolen from the house. But I knew her. She worked here. Her name was Mira." Her eyes went distant. She looked right at me before they began. She mouthed a word. "Run." But I didn't. I just watched. Isaiah's hands tightened around the arms of the chair. "Did anyone else see?" "My father saw me. I was at the top of the cellar stairs. He took me back to my room and told me I'd dreamed it. Then the doctors came. The medicine started." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away from him. "He's been killing me slowly ever since." Isaiah looked out toward the fields, where the last light of day bled into darkness. "Your father did worse than that," he said quietly. "He took my family, sold them like animals to prove himself to the Brotherhood. My wife, my son, my daughter, all gone because he wanted to belong." Eleanor inhaled sharply. He sold them?" "Yes, ma'am. To show he could do what others couldn't." He smiled while he did it. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the cicadas and the distant thunder rolling across the Mississippi. Then Eleanor said, "I think I hate him more for what he's done to you than for what he's done to me." Isaiah turned toward he.
Said, "Hatred won't free you." "No," she said, "but it might keep me alive long enough to see him fall." He studied her face, the resolve in it, the quiet fury that had replaced her trembling weakness. Something had shifted between them, something dangerous and unspoken. "What are you planning, Miss Darrington?" he asked. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You helped me remember. Now I'll help you destroy him." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice low. "We'll need proof. Something that shows what the Brotherhood really is." She nodded slowly. "There's a book. A ledger. My father keeps it hidden beneath the house. It holds their names, their rituals, their debts. Everything they've done. If we find it, we can end them all." He hesitated. "End them how?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed in the half-light. "The same way they end everything else. By fire." A silence fell between them, thick and electric. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked as if listening. Eleanor closed her eyes. "They think I'm broken. They think I'm nothing but a burden and a shame. Let them keep thinking that. Isaiah's reply was quiet but firm. "We'll make them see what they buried." And in that dim room, under the restless whisper of magnolia branches, a pact was sealed, not with ink or blood, but with shared ruin. The days that followed their secret pact moved with a strange calm, as if the plantation itself sensed what was coming. The April heat settled heavy over Magnolia Reach, trapping the air, thick with the smell of blossoms and decay. Gideon Darrington believed his problems were ending. In truth, his reckoning had already begun. Eleanor's transformation was impossible to ignore. Within a week, she was walking short distances through her room, leaning on Isaiah's arm. Her trembling had ceased. Her eyes, once dull and lifeless, now held focus sharp enough to wound. The servants noticed. They whispered in corners, crossing themselves when she passed. "She looks different," they murmured. "Like she knows something the rest of us don't." Isaiah worked quietly, repairing furniture and making himself useful so no one would question why he was always near the house. He spoke little, but he listened, to the servants, to the overseers, to the shifting patterns of the plantation. He learned when Gideon took his afternoon bourbon, when Rourke made his rounds, and when the main house fell silent at night. He studied the cellar door behind the pantry, always locked, always cold to the touch. The key never left Gideon's pocket. At night, when the house slept, Eleanor and Isaiah would meet in her room, speaking in low voices by candlelight. She brought out the small notebook she'd hidden beneath the floorboards, its pages filled with fragmented memories and coded notes. "This," she whispered one night, "is every name I remember. Every man who came to the gatherings. Every night I heard them chanting below." The ink was smeared, but the rage behind it was clear. Isaiah studied the pages. "You wrote this while you were drugged?" "Yes," she said. "Some nights I'd wake up clear-headed for an hour. I'd write until the fog came back. I think something in me wanted to survive, even when I didn't." He nodded, impressed by her will. "You said there's a ledger?" "Yes. My father once told a guest that every ritual was recorded, every member's name written, so none could betray the others. It's his insurance. We'll need to find it." She nodded. "He travels to New Orleans twice a month. He leaves for 3 days each time. The next trip is soon, April 29th. "That's our window," Isaiah said. Eleanor leaned back, exhaustion softening her expression. "And after we find it?" He looked out the window toward the moonlit fields. "Then we decide who deserves to live." A long silence followed. Finally, she spoke again, her tone softer. "Do you believe in justice, Isaiah?" He considered the question. "I used to. Now I believe in balance." She nodded as if she understood. "Then balance it will be." Each night, they refined their plan. Isaiah mapped the house from memory, the servant corridors, the locked doors, the cellar stairs. Eleanor described the secret passages built during her grandfather's time, one that led from the pantry to the old root cellar, another hidden behind the library shelves. She had explored them as a child before she was confined upstairs. On April 24th, a thunderstorm broke over Natchez, hammering the plantation with wind and rain. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the fields and the massive oak that stood before the house. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the storm, whispering as if to someone unseen. "Let it come," she said. "Let it wash this place clean." Downstairs, Isaiah sat in his cabin, carving a small charm from cedar, 3 lines etched into the wood. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He slipped it into his pocket and whispered, "It's almost time." Neither of them slept that night. The evening of April 29th arrived with a tension so thick it could be felt in every corner of Magnolia Reach.
Gideon Darrington had ordered an elaborate dinner for more than 30 guests, planters, judges, ministers, and their powdered wives. The invitations had gone out as a supper in honor of Miss Eleanor's recovery. The irony was lost on no one. It wasn't common for a father to celebrate his daughter's humiliation, but Gideon, ever the showman of southern civility, disguised scandal as sophistication. The main hall glowed with candles set in gold holders. The air shimmered with the heat of roasted meats and sugared cakes, the hum of conversation masking unease. The guests had heard rumors, a strange healer brought from Virginia, a daughter locked away for years suddenly cured. They came out of curiosity, gossip already sharpening like knives. Eleanor sat at her father's right hand, dressed in pale blue silk that strained slightly at the seams. She looked composed, almost regal, her hair pinned neatly, her face thinner than it had been in months. To those who didn't know her, she might have seemed reborn. Only Isaiah, standing silently near the wall with the other servants, saw the truth beneath the stillness. Her fingers trembled slightly in her lap, not with sickness, but with restraint. Gideon raised his glass. "Friends," he began, his voice smooth as bourbon, "you all know the hardship my family has endured. My daughter's illness has been a burden most fathers could not bear. But by God's mercy, and with the aid of a most unconventional helper, her mind and body have begun to heal." A polite murmur rippled through the table. Eleanor kept her eyes down. Gideon gestured toward Isaiah. "This man, Isaiah Cole, has been tending to her for several weeks. His knowledge of natural remedies has achieved what physicians could not." The room grew uneasy. A planter near the end of the table coughed to disguise a laugh. Reverend Marsh cleared his throat. "Surely, Mr. Darrington, you don't mean to suggest—" "I mean exactly what I say," Gideon interrupted, voice tightening, "and I have decided that for Miss Eleanor's continued health, her recovery must remain under his complete supervision." The murmur turned to stunned silence. The words hung in the air like smoke. The wives stared in horror. The men shifted uncomfortably. Judge Harlan spoke first. "You're entrusting your daughter to a slave?" Gideon's jaw clenched. "To the man who cured her, yes." "Permanently?" another asked. "For as long as necessary," Gideon said. "He will have full authority over her household, her treatment, her daily conduct. She is under his care in all matters." The silence was broken only by the creak of chair legs and the faint clinking of silverware. Reverend Marsh's wife whispered something about blasphemy. The judge's wife pressed a hand to her pearls. Eleanor finally lifted her head. Her voice was calm, almost serene. "I trust my father's decision," she said. "Mr. Cole has shown me more mercy than any doctor ever has." Her tone was soft, but her words were deliberate. Across the room, Isaiah felt the power in them. They were not submission, they were warning. The conversation that followed was disjointed, uneasy. Gideon forced laughter, tried to lighten the tension with toasts and flattery, but the mood never recovered. When the guests began to leave, they did so quickly, murmuring to one another as they stepped into the humid night. By the time the last carriage rolled away, only candlelight and silence remained. Gideon poured himself a final drink in his study, convinced he had saved both his fortune and his pride. Upstairs, Eleanor stood before her mirror, unpinning her hair with slow precision. Her reflection stared back, calm, calculating. Downstairs, Isaiah gathered the empty dishes, moving quietly through the dining room. The echo of Gideon's announcement lingered in his mind. He had been given authority over the master's daughter, and neither Gideon Darrington nor the Brotherhood understood what that truly meant. The house was silent after the dinner ended, that heavy kind of silence that settles after something has gone terribly wrong, but no one will speak of it. The guests had fled Magnolia Reach under the pretense of politeness, their carriages rattling down the muddy road, their voices hushed in disbelief. Gideon Darrington stood by the front window, drink in hand, watching the last lantern vanish into the trees. He told himself he didn't care what they thought. He told himself that power was all that mattered. That the Brotherhood would see his obedience and reward it. But even as he drank, he couldn't silence the truth gnawing at him, that his name would never again be spoken in Natchez without shame. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her room, still in her blue dress, staring at the faint reflections in her mirror. The pearls at her throat felt like chains. For years she had been invisible, dismissed as a madwoman. Tonight, her father had made her visible again, but only as a spectacle. The obedient daughter under the care of her servant. She could still hear the guests' laughter echoing in her mind, that brittle, frightened sound that people make when they witness something they can't comprehend. Isaiah came to her door an hour past midnight. He didn't knock. She was expecting him. When he entered, she was standing by the window, the moonlight cutting across her pale face. "They believed him," she said quietly. "Not all," Isaiah replied. "Some were frightened. Some will talk. The Brotherhood won't like attention." "Good," she said. "Let them choke on their own secrecy." Isaiah moved closer, speaking in the low, even tone he always used when the world above seemed ready to break. "Your father's gone to his study. He's drunk." "I heard him telling the overseer that the Brotherhood would settle the accounts by next week. They'll send men here for the ritual soon." Eleanor turned sharply. "Ritual? They meet every few weeks. The cellar below this house is one of their places. They believe blood feeds the land." She shivered, but forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then that's where the ledger is kept." Isaiah nodded. "When he leaves for New Orleans next, we'll go down there. Take whatever proof we can find." Eleanor moved to the small writing desk by her bed and retrieved her hidden notebook again. "There's something you need to see." She opened to a page covered in cramped, uneven writing. A child's handwriting grown desperate. "This is what I remember from that night, 16 years ago," she said. 13 men. All wore masks carved with vines. My father's was gold. The others, iron. They chanted in Latin. I didn't know the words then, but later I found one phrase written in an old book. Sanguis dat fructum. It means, the blood gives fruit. Isaiah studied the words, then looked up at her. "You remember all this, after years of laudanum?" "I remember it because they wanted me to forget." Her voice was steady now, colder than before. Every lie they told me became a reminder instead. Every dose of poison only preserved what I saw. For the first time, Isaiah believed she might be even stronger than he was. He closed the notebook and handed it back. "You keep this hidden. No one else can see it. If we fail, it needs to outlive us." She took it from him, their fingers brushing briefly, a spark of shared intent that neither dared name. "We won't fail," she said. Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. Both froze. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate step, followed by another. Isaiah motioned for silence. The noise stopped near the staircase. For a long moment, they listened. Then nothing, only the wind pressing against the shutters. Eleanor whispered, "He knows something's changing." Isaiah nodded. "Then let him think it's just his imagination. The real fear comes when he realizes it's not." He slipped back into the hallway, leaving her in the pale wash of moonlight. Eleanor turned once more to the window, watching the fields sway under the night sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of her father's cruelty, the world still moved. And soon, she promised herself, it would move without him. On the morning of May the 14th, 1838, Gideon Darrington left Magnolia Reach under the pretense of business in New Orleans. His carriage creaked down the long dirt road at sunrise, wheels cutting deep grooves in the damp earth. Behind him, the plantation seemed to exhale, as if the land itself knew something foul had departed. From an upstairs window, Eleanor watched the carriage until it vanished beyond the cypress grove. Only then did she whisper, "Now." By nightfall the house had gone still. The overseer, Rourke, had retired to his quarters after too much whiskey. The house servants had gone to their cabins. The moon hung low, red and swollen. Isaiah waited in the shadows outside the back porch, his expression unreadable, a lantern in one hand and a small crowbar in the other. When Eleanor appeared at the door dressed in a plain grey cloak, her hair tied back, she looked less like a plantation daughter and more like a ghost come to finish unfinished business. Neither spoke as they moved through the kitchen, their footsteps light on the floorboards. The pantry door loomed ahead, an ordinary door that led to the shelves of preserved fruit and flour sacks. But Isaiah knew what lay behind it. He pressed his hand to the wall beside the last shelf, found the small indentation he'd noticed weeks earlier, and pushed. A soft click echoed through the quiet house. The wall shifted slightly, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Eleanor inhaled sharply. "I haven't been down there since I was 12, she whispered. "Then stay close," Isaiah murmured. The stairs were steep and slick with age. The smell hit them first, damp earth, mold, and beneath it something metallic, unmistakable, blood long soaked into wood. Isaiah lifted the lantern, its weak light pushing back only a little of the dark. The cellar was larger than he expected, its low ceiling held by thick oak beams. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars sealed in wax, stacks of ledgers, and objects whose purpose neither could guess. At the center stood a table, massive, stained black in places where the wood grain had darkened with time. The surface bore shallow grooves, almost deliberate, running like channels. Candles surrounded it in iron holders, melted down to uneven stubs. Eleanor stood motionless, her breath shallow. "It was here," she whispered. "This is where it happened." Isaiah placed the lantern on the table, its light trembling across the walls. Strange symbols had been carved into the beams, interlocking vines and roots, a serpent biting its own tail, a chalice overflowing. The same emblem that sealed the Brotherhood's letters. He ran his fingers along the carvings, feeling the fine precision. "They built this place for their gatherings," he said quietly. "Not just for meetings, for sacrifice." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "There's more, sir." He walked to the far wall, pressing her hand against a section of stone that looked smoother than the rest. "I remember him pushing something here." Isaiah examined it closely. The mortar was faintly cracked. He wedged the crowbar into the seam and pressed. The wall gave way with a dull groan, revealing a second chamber, smaller, colder, lined with shelves that gleamed faintly in the lantern light. At the center stood a wooden stand holding a massive book bound in dark leather, the edges scorched as though it had survived a fire. Metal clasps kept it shut. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. "The ledger," she breathed. Isaiah approached it cautiously, brushing off the dust. The clasp creaked as he opened it. The first page bore the Brotherhood's sigil, and the words, "By the vine we are bound, by the harvest we are fed." Beneath that the names began. Dozens of them, written in an elegant, steady hand. Dates, locations, offerings. Eleanor clutched the edge of the stand to keep from falling. "God forgive us," she whispered. Isaiah turned another page, his voice low. "He won't. Not for this." The cellar seemed to pulse around them, alive with the echo of every cry it had ever heard. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Above their heads the floorboards creaked faintly, though the house was supposed to be empty. Eleanor met his eyes. "We have to hurry." Isaiah nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he began to turn the next page. What they saw written there would change everything. Isaiah's fingers trembled as he turned the next page, the paper thick and rough beneath his skin. The ink had bled in places, warped by time and humidity, but the words were still legible. Too legible. Each line was a record, cold and methodical, written as if describing simple transactions rather than horrors. October 1832. Offering, female, age 19, servant from Ashfield Estate. Purpose, renewal of fertility in the southern fields. Witnessed by 13. June 1834. Offering, male, age 10, stable boy. Purpose, test of endurance. Outcome, successful. Land yielded double harvest. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with revulsion.
"Children," she whispered. "They used children."
Isaiah's jaw clenched, his pulse pounding in his ears. "They called it harvest," he said bitterly. "But this is slaughter." He flipped another page, and his eyes caught on a name, Sarah Cole. His breath stopped. The entry was brief, like all the others. November 1837. Offering acquired through purchase from Virginia. Female and offspring separated. Transfer authorized by G. Darrington. Payment received by Brotherhood account. The world went silent. He stared at the ink until the letters blurred. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. His hand closed around the page so tightly the paper nearly tore. Eleanor's voice broke through the haze. "Isaiah, what is it?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and hollow. "That's my wife." His voice came out strangled. "He sold her. To them." Eleanor's face went pale. "Your father?" Isaiah shook his head, rage trembling through every word. No, not just him. All of them. They passed her between plantations like currency. And when they were done... He couldn't finish. His throat closed, it on the words. He turned the page again, searching, desperate. There, 2 more names. Benjamin Cole, age 8. Ruth Cole, age 6. Both listed beneath Secondary Offering, February 1838. He slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing through the stone chamber like a gunshot. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Only the low hiss of the lantern filled the space. Eleanor finally whispered, "We can take this to the magistrate. To anyone in town." Isaiah laughed, low and hollow. "To who, Miss Darrington? The judge? His name's right there." He opened the ledger again and pointed to the long list of signatures beneath each ritual. "Every man who holds power in this county has bled someone dry to get it. There's no justice in their courts." Eleanor stared down at the open page. The handwriting was neat, elegant, almost beautiful. "My father wrote this with his own hand," she said softly. "Every name, every sin. He recorded it like he was proud." Isaiah's hands were shaking, but his voice was calm now, too calm. "We'll copy what matters, the proof, the names. Then we burn the rest." She looked up sharply. "Burn it? This could destroy them." He met her gaze, eyes cold. "It already has. This book doesn't belong to the law. It belongs to the fire. And when they burn, it burns with them." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. There was logic in his fury. Terrible, unrelenting logic. "I'll copy," she said. They worked in silence. The lantern's flame flickered as Eleanor's pen scratched across the paper. Isaiah read aloud, his voice flat, each word another wound. Names, dates, rituals, payments. Outside, thunder rolled closer. Rain began to drum faintly against the earth above. When she finished, Eleanor placed her shaking hand over the copied pages. "We have enough. This alone could damn every man in that book." Isaiah looked at the ledger one last time, then closed it carefully. "Then let's damn them all." But as he turned toward the stairs, a sound stopped them both. A slow, deliberate creak from above, floorboards shifting under weight. Someone was in the house. Eleanor's breath caught. "He's not supposed to be back yet." Isaiah snuffed the lantern's flame. Darkness swallowed the cellar. "Then we move," he whispered. They stood frozen, listening. The steps grew louder, descending the kitchen stairs. Gideon Darrington had come home early. The first sound was the door above them creaking open, slow, deliberate, far too calm for a man returning from travel. Then came the faint rhythm of boots on wood, each step echoing through the dark stairwell. Gideon Darrington wasn't rushing. He was descending with the patience of someone who already knew what he'd find. Eleanor's breath hitched. Isaiah gripped her wrist gently, pulling her back into the shadows. The cellar was black now, only the faintest trace of lantern smoke lingering in the air. From the open ledger stand, the metallic clasps glinted dimly, catching what little moonlight slipped through the cracks above. "Stay quiet," Isaiah mouthed. They could hear him speaking to someone. 2 voices, maybe 3, low and muffled. Then Gideon's voice rose, calm and unhurried. "I told you. I felt it the night of the dinner. She was too calm. He was too still. They've been conspiring." Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Isaiah's grip tightened slightly on her arm. The footsteps grew louder until the glow of a lantern appeared at the top of the stairs. "Light the way," Gideon said to the men behind him. The lantern swayed, spilling yellow light across the cellar floor. Isaiah's pulse hammered in his ears. There was no escape except the narrow passage they'd opened in the far wall. But crossing the room meant stepping into the light. He could see the outline of Eleanor's face, pale with fear, yet rigid with anger. When Gideon reached the bottom step, he paused. "So," he said softly, scanning the room. "You found it." He stepped forward, his boots splashing lightly in the damp earth. The lantern in his hand illuminated the open ledger, the scattered papers, the cracked stone where they'd broken through. Behind him, 2 men waited, both wearing the Brotherhood's signet rings. "Did you really think," Gideon said, voice almost tender, "that I'd leave this house unguarded? That I didn't know what you were doing?" Eleanor stepped out from the shadows before Isaiah could stop her. "I thought you'd have at least the decency to let me forget," she said coldly, "but you couldn't even grant me that." Gideon turned his face toward her. The candlelight softened him, but his eyes were like iron. "You were never meant to remember, Eleanor. That was your mother's fault. She filled your head with ideas, compassion, conscience, weakness." "She killed herself because of you," Eleanor spat. "Because she knew." Gideon's jaw twitched. "She was too fragile for the truth." He took another step forward, lowering the lantern slightly. "And now here you are, repeating her mistakes." Isaiah stepped from the darkness then, silent and slow. The flicker of the lantern revealed the blood-smeared page clutched in his hand, the record of his wife and children. His voice was steady, low, almost gentle. "Your mistakes go further than your family, Gideon." For the first time, Gideon's calm faltered. "You," he said, narrowing his eyes. "You were supposed to obey. You were given purpose, You gave me nothing but graves," Isaiah said. One of the men behind Gideon shifted nervously. "Sir, we should—" "Be silent," Gideon snapped. Eleanor's voice cut through the air. "We've seen everything. The ledger, the names, the rituals. Do you really think this will disappear again?" Gideon smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to men who had never been afraid of consequence. "My dear, the world will believe whatever I tell it. You are mad. He is property, and madness and property do not speak in courts." Isaiah took a step closer, the tension in his frame coiling tight. "Then maybe we won't speak," he said. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air in the cellar felt alive, the silence ready to snap. Then Gideon said, "Kill him." The 2 men lunged forward. Isaiah moved first. He snatched the crowbar from the floor, swinging in one fluid motion. The metal connected with a sickening crack against the nearest man's skull. The second man drew a pistol, but Eleanor screamed, not in fear, but to draw his eyes toward her. The split-second distraction was enough. Isaiah drove the crowbar into the man's ribs, wrenching it free as the lantern dropped from Gideon's hand, shattering. Flames sputtered across the spilled oil, light blooming wildly across the stone walls. Shadows danced as Gideon stumbled backward, shock flickering across his face. Isaiah turned to him, breathing hard. "You wanted your harvest," he said, voice rough. "Then reap it." The fire began to crawl along the wooden beams, licking upward toward the ceiling. Gideon backed toward the stairs, his composure fracturing for the first time in his life. "You'll burn for this," he hissed. Isaiah's eyes were dark, almost peaceful. "So will you." The cellar roared with the crackle of flames as the first screams echoed through Magnolia Reach. The fire spread faster than either of them could have imagined. The spilled oil from the shattered lantern crawled across the cellar floor like liquid flame, snaking through the grooves in the earth, tracing every blood-stained ritual mark. Within seconds, the chamber's low ceiling began to glow orange. Smoke thickened, curling upward in choking spirals. Gideon Darrington stumbled backward, one hand clutched against the wall for balance, the other covering his mouth. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he choked out. Isaiah's silhouette moved through the smoke, slow and deliberate, the crowbar still in his hand. "I've done what you've spent your life avoiding," he said. "I've answered for what you've sown." Eleanor was coughing violently, the heat clawing at her lungs. She grabbed Isaiah's arm. "We have to get out. It's spreading too fast." He nodded, eyes darting toward the narrow stairwell. Flames were licking the steps now, feeding on years of soaked wood and forgotten sins. Behind them, one of the Brotherhood men moaned from the ground, blood pooling around his head. The other lay motionless, eyes open but empty. Gideon's voice broke through the roar of the fire, wild now, no longer the polished tone of a gentleman. "You think you can burn it away? You can't destroy what we've built. You can't destroy me." Isaiah turned to him slowly. "No," he said, calm as a man making a promise. "But I can make sure the world never remembers you." Gideon lunged toward the ledger on the stand, clutching at it even as flames licked its edges. "This is my legacy! My proof!" he screamed. The fire caught his sleeve, and in an instant his fine coat was ablaze. The smell of burning cloth and flesh filled the air. Eleanor screamed, but Isaiah pulled her toward the secret passage. "Leave him!" he shouted. "He made his choice." She hesitated for half a second, her gaze fixed on her father, writhing on the floor, his cries twisting between pain and rage. Then she turned away. Together, they stumbled into the narrow tunnel behind the stone wall. The passage was cramped, the air suffocating with smoke. Isaiah led the way, dragging Eleanor behind him, his shoulder brushing damp earth with every step. Behind them, the chamber roared as the ceiling began to collapse. Beams cracked, stone split. It sounded like the house itself was screaming. When they emerged into the night, the world felt too bright. Rain had started to fall, light but steady, hissing as it met the spreading fire. The main house glowed from within like a lantern, its windows flashing orange and gold. Smoke poured through the roof, carrying the stench of burning wood, and something else, darker, older. Eleanor fell to her knees in the mud, gasping, coughing up soot. Isaiah dropped beside her, his chest heaving. For a moment, they just sat there, side by side, watching the flames consume everything that had bound them to that cursed place. She turned her head toward him, voice hoarse. "Is it over?" Isaiah stared into the inferno, where shadows twisted in the collapsing doorway. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." A sudden scream tore through the air, high, ragged, unmistakably human. Gideon was still alive, still burning somewhere inside the house. Eleanor covered her ears and closed her eyes, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. Isaiah didn't look away. He watched until the screams faded into the crackling of the fire, until there was nothing left but the sound of rain and the settling ruin. Only then did he speak, his voice low, almost a prayer. "Now it's over." Eleanor turned toward him, trembling. "He'll be remembered as a victim," she whispered. "They'll say it was an accident." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Then let them. The truth doesn't need their belief. It only needs to survive." He looked back at the burning plantation, the ledger now ashes beneath the earth. "And it will," he added. "Through us." The rain fell harder. The flames hissed, but they did not die. Not yet. By dawn, Magnolia Reach was unrecognizable. The grand white house that had stood for 3 generations was nothing but a blackened skeleton, its chimneys jutting like tombstones against a smoke-stained sky. The rain had turned the soil to mud, thick and red, streaked with ash. What little remained of the great Darrington estate hissed and smouldered beneath the grey light of morning. Eleanor and Isaiah stood at the edge of the ruined field, their clothes soaked through, their faces grey with soot. Neither had spoken for hours. The only sound was the distant crackle of dying fire and the occasional crash of a collapsing beam. Eleanor's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "He's gone." Isaiah didn't answer. He stared at the smoking ruins, jaw tight. "He was gone long before this," he said quietly. They had spent the last hours dragging what little they could salvage from the flames. A few papers, a small chest of coins, the copies of the ledger pages Eleanor had written. The rest was lost, devoured by the fire that now seemed almost holy in its destruction. She looked down at the folded pages in her hands, the ink smeared but still legible. "What do we do with them?" she asked. Isaiah hesitated. "We keep them safe. Not for the law, not for vengeance, for truth. One day someone will need to know what happened here." Eleanor looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips despite the devastation. "You sound like a preacher." He shook his head slowly. "No, miss. Preachers talk about forgiveness." She looked back toward the smouldering ruin. "I don't want forgiveness," she said. "I want silence. I want the world to think this place never existed." Isaiah studied her for a long moment. "Then we'll let them think that. But we'll know." A faint wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet ash and burned magnolia blossoms. It smelled like endings. Eleanor knelt in the mud, digging a small hollow near the roots of a cypress tree. She placed the folded pages inside a tin box she'd taken from her father's desk, sealed it shut, and covered it with dirt. "If someone finds it someday," she said, "let them decide whether to believe it." Isaiah watched her, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he extended a hand to help her up. "There's a wagon by the old road," he said. "Rourke ran off before the fire reached the quarters. I saw him take one of the mules. He won't be back." "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to lighten. "North. Maybe as far as I can get. There are people out there helping our kind move through the country, finding new names, new lives. I reckon they could use another pair of hands." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And me? You said you wanted to disappear. There's money enough in that chest for travel. You could go to Charleston, or Philadelphia. Start again." She turned toward him, studying his face as if trying to memorize it. "If I go and they never find me, what should they say I was?" Isaiah's answer came without hesitation. "Free?" They stood there for a long moment, 2 figures framed by the smoking ruin of a world that had devoured them both. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "Then go, before someone comes." He nodded once, then began walking toward the tree line. The mud sucked at his boots, each step pulling at him like the past trying to hold him back. Eleanor watched until he disappeared into the grey morning mist. Then she turned toward what was left of her home, the house where she'd been born, poisoned and reborn again through fire, and whispered a final goodbye. When the authorities came days later, they would call it an accident. They would say the master's candle fell during a night of prayer. They would bury what was left of Gideon Darrington beside his ancestors and write "Beloved Father" on his stone. But the land would remember the truth. It always does. By midsummer of 1838, the ashes of Magnolia Reach had already begun to sink into the earth. The vines crept over the scorched foundations, swallowing what little remained. The county men who came to inspect the ruins found nothing but black soil and silence. They filed their reports, exchanged uneasy glances, and told themselves that fire was nature's punishment for pride. None of them spoke of the bones unearthed near the cellar. Small bones, too delicate to have belonged to men. Word spread fast through Natchez and the neighbouring parishes. At first it was just gossip whispered in the churchyards and along the river banks. The Darrington house burned, they said, everyone gone. Not even a dog survived. Some claimed they saw the sky glow red from 10 miles away. Others swore they heard screams carried on the wind that night, like the land itself was howling. But as weeks passed, the story changed. Rumour hardened into legend, the way all dark truths eventually do. The tale said the fire was God's wrath, that Gideon Darrington had made pacts with unholy forces, and that those forces had come to collect. Another version claimed his mad daughter, locked away for years, had summoned the devil himself to end her father's reign. Down in the slave quarters across the county, a different story took root. They spoke of a man named Isaiah, the one who'd come from Virginia, the one who'd walked out of the flames untouched. Some said he was flesh and blood. Others said he was a spirit sent by the ancestors, a ghost in human skin who brought judgment to the wicked. They said he didn't die when the house fell. He walked north, carrying with him a charm carved from cedar and the names of those he loved. Wherever he went, masters began to fear their own cellars. In hidden corners of the South, the story spread like wildfire. Field hands whispered it to one another in the dark before dawn. Mothers told it to their children to remind them that even the powerful could burn. They called it the Reckoning at Magnolia Reach. No one ever found Eleanor Darrington. Some said she fled to Charleston and lived under another name, writing her story in secret before vanishing into the fog. Others believed she drowned herself in the river, unable to bear the weight of what she'd done. But those who claimed to have seen her spoke of a pale woman who appeared at crossroads at dusk, leaving behind the faint smell of magnolia and smoke. One autumn evening, a traveling preacher stopped in a small Mississippi town with a leather satchel of strange relics. Among them was a page of parchment blackened by fire, its writing faded, but still visible. The preacher said he found it buried beneath an old cypress near the river. He sold it for a bottle of whiskey to a man who couldn't read. That man, in turn, passed it to someone else, who passed it again. Eventually it disappeared. But those who'd seen it swore they recognized the name at the top, G. Darrington, and beside it, 13 signatures written in the same careful hand. No one could say where the page went, or if it ever truly existed. But sometimes, when the night was thick and the wind carried the scent of rain, the people near Natchez said they could still hear it, the low hum of voices chanting beneath the earth, the echo of a harvest that was never meant to grow. And in those moments, they would whisper a prayer not for the dead, but for the living, because the fire that ended Magnolia Reach didn't just burn the guilty, it lit a truth that refused to die. For months after the fire, the story of Magnolia Reach refused to rest. Even as the ashes cooled and the last embers sank beneath the soil, strange things began to happen across Colfax County. The Darrington name, once spoken with reverence, became a curse whispered behind closed doors. Their surviving relatives, distant cousins and business partners, found their fortunes rotting from the inside out. Crops withered, livestock died without reason, and debts once easily ignored came due all at once. It was as if the land itself had turned against their bloodline. No one knew that beneath that same cursed soil, just beyond the ruined foundation of the house, something had been buried that was never meant to be found. The tin box, the one Eleanor Darrington had sealed with trembling hands and buried before, refleeing into the mist. Inside it, the copied pages of the ledger waited in silence, pressed tight against one another like bones in a shallow grave. Isaiah Cole had travelled far by then, moving through the thick woods and backwater roads that twisted like veins across the south. He kept his head down, his story untold. In one town, he worked as a carpenter. In another, as a ferryman. He changed his name when asked and kept to himself, but at night he'd wake to the smell of smoke and magnolia, his hands clenched tight around the cedar charm he carried. Sometimes he'd swear he heard his wife's voice on the wind, whispering the same word she'd spoken the night they were separated. Run. He didn't stop running until he reached the Tennessee border. There, among a small group of freed and fugitive men, he began to talk, carefully, in pieces, never saying the Darrington name, but describing what he'd seen, what he'd burned, what he'd avenged. The men listened, then told others, and from those whispers, something began to grow, a network of travelers and guides who helped others move through the night towards safety. Some said Isaiah was the first to mark safe houses with the carved cedar sign, 3 vertical lines, the same that bore his family's names. He never spoke of revenge again, but those who knew him said his silence carried it all the same. Eleanor's trail was harder to follow. A woman matching her description boarded a riverboat out of Natchez 2 weeks after the fire, dressed in mourning black, with a single trunk and a forged letter of passage. The boat captain later said she spoke little and always faced upriver, as if she were watching something she'd left behind. When the vessel stopped in Memphis, she disembarked and disappeared into the crowded streets. Years later in Philadelphia, a physician's journal made mention of a Miss E. Dalton, a recluse who rented a small house near the river and treated sick children with herbs and strange tonics. She was said to have an accent that didn't fit anywhere and hands scarred from burns. She died quietly in 1849 during a cholera outbreak, leaving behind no relatives, only a locked chest containing a journal written in a cipher no one could read. The chest vanished when the city cleared her belongings, but rumor claimed a boy who helped bury her took 1 page before it was gone. On that page, the same words were scrawled again and again in faded ink. Truth is fire. It devours, but it cleanses. In Natchez, the ruins of Magnolia Reach were left to rot. Children dared one another to go near the charred remains of the cellar, where even decades later, the air still smelled faintly of burned oil and something far worse. The elders warned them to stay away, saying that those who listened too long could still hear voices under the earth. And sometimes, when the wind was right, they did. It was the summer of 1866, 28 years after the fire, when the ground at Magnolia Reach stirred again. The war had come and gone, leaving Mississippi scarred and starving, its proud families ruined, its old plantations crumbling back into the soil. Most had forgotten the name Darrington, except the elders who refused to speak it aloud. The land had been sold twice, but no says. Ni kept it for long. Every crop that touched that soil failed. Every animal born there sickened. So the place lay abandoned, reclaimed by weeds and ghosts. That year, a group of freedmen and their families settled near the edge of the property. They were rebuilding, trying to carve a living from the ashes of a world that had once chained them. Among them was a man named Jonah Wright, a preacher's son who believed no land was too cursed for redemption. He decided to build a church on the edge of the old Darrington field. The others warned him not to, but Jonah only smiled. "God's light burns away darkness," he said, "even here." The digging began in late June. They cleared the vines, pulled up roots, and uncovered what was left of the old foundations, bricks fused together by fire, still black and brittle. Beneath one of the collapsed chimneys, Jonah's spade struck metal, a hollow clink. He knelt, brushing away the dirt, and unearthed a rusted tin box, its lid sealed tight. The others gathered around as he pried it open. Inside were folded pages, yellowed and damp, but mostly intact. The ink had faded, but the handwriting, small, deliberate, unmistakably feminine, was still legible. Jonah read the first few lines aloud. They were dated 1838. The words trembled with fury and grief. "My father's sins will not die with him. The truth must survive, even if I do not." The group fell silent. One of the women crossed herself. "That's witch talk," she muttered. But Jonah kept reading. The entries told of secret meetings, rituals and sacrifices, the Brotherhood of the Vine, the fires beneath the house, the ledger of blood. It described men by name, men Jonah had only heard of in sermons and courthouse dedications. Judges, preachers, landowners. Their descendants now held power across the state. By sunset, Jonah closed the pages, his hands trembling. "This is evil laid bare," he said softly. "But it's also proof. Proof of what they did to our people. Proof of why this land never rests." They debated burning it again, but Jonah stopped them. "Fire hid this truth once," he said. "It won't hide it twice." That night, he carried the pages to his cabin, wrapped them in oilcloth, and placed them under his mattress. But sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words again, the calm, measured descriptions of horror written in a woman's neat hand. He dreamed of the cellar, the table, the screams. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sound of chanting still in his ears. 2 weeks later, Jonah disappeared. His family said he went to Natchez to show the papers to a newspaperman. The newspaperman swore Jonah never arrived. The horse was found wandering by the roadside, saddle empty, the oilcloth gone. The next month, a fire consumed the small church he'd built. No one was hurt. But when the flames died, a single thing was found among the ashes, a page half burned, stuck to the altar by melted wax. The writing was blurred, but 2 words could still be read. "They're watching." After that, no one tried to build on that land again. The trees grew thick and crooked. Birds avoided the area. And the people of the county learned to pass by Magnolia Reach without looking too long at the ruins, because sometimes when the sun was low and the air still, they swore they could see smoke rising from the ground, as if the fire that ended the Darrington line was still burning somewhere beneath the earth. By the winter of 1871, whispers of the Brotherhood of the Vine began to crawl back through Mississippi like a disease that had only been sleeping. The war had broken their world, but not their hunger. The men who had once worn hoods and drank blood under the name of harvest now wore suits and carried titles: judges, bankers, legislators. They spoke in drawing rooms instead of cellars, but their creed hadn't changed. They still believed power came from ownership. They still believed the weak were meant to feed the strong. In Natchez, a man named Judge Horace Pelham, son of one of the original 13, received a sealed letter without a return address. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, the ink uneven and scorched at the edges. It bore only a few words, written in that same looping, deliberate script. "The ledger survives. The land remembers." Pelham read the note twice, then burned it in his fireplace. But that night, he didn't sleep. He dreamed of cypress roots and whispers rising from the swamp. By morning, he sent word to the others, the surviving sons and grandsons of the old Brotherhood. They met 3 nights later in an abandoned plantation house outside of Vicksburg. The men gathered by candlelight, their faces pale, their hands trembling, as they passed around a single relic wrapped in silk. An iron ring carved with the image of entwined vines and a serpent. The last artifact of the old order. "This message," Pelham said, "means someone knows. We were promised the ledger was lost to flame." One of the younger men, nervous and eager to please, said, "Then we find whoever sent it. We silence them." But Pelham only stared into the candle flame. "You can't silence the dead." The room went quiet. He told them about Jonah Wright's disappearance years earlier, the preacher's son who'd found the buried pages. They say his body was never found, but men in Natchez claim they saw someone carrying something wrapped in oilcloth near the docks, and that same week, the offices of the Southern Gazette burned to the ground. No one knows who lit it. Another man leaned forward. "You think the ledger still exists?" Pelham hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. And if it resurfaces, it will not only destroy our names, it will reveal what our fathers truly did. It will turn history itself against us." Someone whispered, "Then the fire failed." "No," Pelham said softly. "The fire began something we can't control." A cold wind swept through the broken windows, extinguishing half the candles. The men shivered. One muttered a prayer. Pelham poured himself a glass of whiskey to hide the shaking of his hand. He looked at the others and said, "The Brotherhood is no longer about power. It is about survival." Outside, the night was thick with mist. Somewhere in the swamp beyond the fields, a faint orange glow flickered, the kind of light that shouldn't have existed in the rain. Some swore it was lightning. Others said it was the ghost of Magnolia Reach burning again, refusing to die. That night, one of the men, Edwin Maris, grandson of a banker who had sat beside Gideon Darrington, rode home along the old river road. He was found at dawn, trampled beside his horse, his face frozen in terror. In his hand was a scrap of paper burned along the edges, with a single word scrawled across it in faint, childlike handwriting. Ruth. The Brotherhood met once more after that, just once. Pelham insisted it was coincidence, bad luck, hysteria born of guilt. But none of them slept easy again. Because in their dreams they heard footsteps in the cellar, and the whisper of a woman's voice, calm and patient, saying, "I told you, the truth survives the fire." By 1884, Magnolia Reach had vanished from most maps, erased as though it had never existed. The road that once led to its gates had been reclaimed by the swamp, and the only marker of what had been there was a half-collapsed chimney rising from the weeds like a gravestone. Yet travellers along the Natchez trace still spoke of it, always at night, always in hushed tones. They said if you passed that stretch of road after midnight, you might see a faint glow through the trees, a warm, flickering light that looked like lantern fire. But when you followed it, the light would move, always just ahead, until the ground beneath your feet grew soft and black, and the air smelled of smoke and wet magnolia. And if you didn't turn back right then, you'd hear it. The sound of someone humming, low and slow, a woman's voice singing a song without words. They called her the Ghost of Magnolia Reach. No one could agree who she was. Some said she was Eleanor Darrington, doomed to wander the ruins for the sins of her bloodline. Others claimed she was one of the enslaved women sacrificed in the cellar, her soul tethered to the land until every last trace of the Brotherhood was wiped away. But a few, the ones who spoke of her with reverence instead of fear, said she wasn't a ghost at all. She was a watcher, a guardian, the living echo of justice. In Natchez, Judge Horace Pelham grew old and paranoid. He rarely left his home, claiming that each night he woke to the scent of burning wood and the faint sound of knocking from beneath the floorboards. His servants said he'd sometimes wander the halls at dawn, muttering to someone who wasn't there, whispering, "You can't have it. It's gone. I burned it." They thought he was senile. But then one morning his bed was found empty. The front door was open, and a trail of footprints led down toward the riverbank. The sheriff found him 2 days later, washed up in the reeds. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, his mouth filled with river mud. Clutched in his hand was a small piece of paper, burned around the edges and damp from the water. The words were barely legible, but they read, "By the vine, we are bound." After that, no one in Natchez dared speak the Brotherhood's name aloud. Families quietly destroyed old liquor, letters and ledgers. Portraits were burned, records scrubbed clean. But it was too late. The legend had already rooted itself in the soil. That autumn, a group of hunters passing near the ruins claimed to see a figure standing among the trees. A tall man in a tattered coat, his face shadowed. He was holding something small and carved in his hands. One of the men called out, asking if he was lost. The figure looked up just as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. Then he vanished into the fog. They say the hunters found 3 straight lines carved into the bark of the nearest tree. Fresh. Deep. No one could explain it, but those who knew the old stories understood. Isaiah Cole had kept his promise. And the land, the cursed, blood-soaked land of Magnolia Reach, still remembered every name, every scream, every drop of blood spilled upon it. Some nights, the mist would rise, thick and white, curling over the ground like breath. And if you stood too long in that mist, you'd feel it move around you, whispering, not in words but in memory. It would tell you that fire may destroy flesh, but not truth. That silence may bury names, but not guilt. And that some hauntings are not punishments at all. They are reminders. By the turn of the century, the legend of Magnolia Reach had drifted from whispered warning to folklore, the kind of story told around dying campfires and in the corners of juke joints when the night stretched long. People didn't remember the names anymore. Darrington, Cole, the Brotherhood. But the bones of the story endured. A house that burned for its sins. A girl who remembered too much. A man who walked through fire and lived. In 1901, a historian from New Orleans named Dr. Amos Gentry came across a passing mention of the Magnolia fire in an old Natchez newspaper. It described the Darrington estate's destruction as a tragedy of divine mystery. Gentry, drawn to lost histories and southern hauntings, decided to find the ruins for himself. He arrived in late spring, traveling by rail and carriage until the road gave way to swamp. The locals warned him not to go further. The land, they said, was bad. Tools rusted there. Livestock vanished. Even the crows avoided its trees. But Gentry pressed on, curiosity outweighing superstition. He reached the site near dusk. The air was heavy with humidity, the insects loud enough to drown out thought. What he found was not what he expected. Only fragments of brick, a sagging iron gate, and a patch of earth blacker than the rest, where nothing grew. Still, something drew him closer. A sense that the ground was alive, pulsing faintly beneath his boots. He pitched camp near the edge of the ruins, telling himself he'd dig at first light. But that night, as the frogs fell silent and the wind died, Gentry woke to the smell of smoke. He sat up, heart hammering, and saw a faint glow spreading across the field. Not fire. Not quite. It was light without flame, seeping through the cracks of the earth like the ghost of something that refused to die. Then came the sound, low at first, almost a hum. Then voices, distant, overlapping, too many to count. Chanting. The same words over and over in a tongue Gentry didn't know but somehow understood. Sanguis dat fructum. The blood gives fruit. He stumbled toward the ruins, drawn by both fear and fascination. Through the mist, he saw her. A woman in grey, standing among the charred remains of what had once been the cellar. Her face was pale, eyes bright as coals,
hair unbound. She looked directly at him and raised a hand. "It's not finished," she whispered. "The truth still sleeps." Then she was gone. The light faded. The ground cooled beneath his feet. At dawn, Gentry began to dig. Hours later, his spade struck metal. He unearthed a rusted box, smaller than he expected, its hinges fused. Inside were fragments of paper, brittle, burned, but still inked with careful handwriting. He read the first words aloud. "If you find this, know that the blood of the innocent still cries for witness." He stopped there. The air had gone too still. Gentry returned to New Orleans the next day, pale and trembling. He tried to catalogue what he found, but within weeks the papers were stolen from his university office. No one saw who took them. Not long after, Gentry was found dead in his study. His heart stopped. His hands blackened with soot. The authorities called it an accident, a fire from a spilled lantern, but the locals said otherwise. They said the past had finally reached out and silenced him. And deep in the ruined soil of Magnolia Reach, where the cypress roots tangled through bones and stone, the truth waited, not buried, not forgotten, only sleeping. By 1932, Magnolia Reach had passed fully into myth. The land was sold again and again, always cheap, always abandoned. A timber company tried to clear it once, but after 2 men were crushed by a falling oak on the same day, the crew refused to return. The swamp reclaimed everything. Only the old chimney stood, half swallowed by vines, a lone black tooth in the earth's mouth. That spring, a pair of surveyors from Baton Rouge came to map the area for a new road. They camped near the ruins, laughing off the warnings from townsfolk. The younger of the two, a man named Samuel Keene, found the night air strange, too quiet, too heavy. The frogs had stopped singing. The crickets too. Only the wind moved, whispering through the trees like breath over glass. Samuel couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he left the tent and walked toward the old foundations. He told himself he just wanted a closer look, but something in him, a pull deeper than curiosity, guided his steps. The ground was soft, almost warm. Fireflies blinked between the reeds, glowing and fading like the sparks of a dying fire. Then he saw her. A woman standing where the great house once stood, dressed in white this time, not grey, not shadow, but pale as moonlight. She was looking down, hands clasped before her as if in prayer. Samuel froze. The woman lifted her head slowly and met his gaze. Her eyes were filled with sadness that didn't belong to any one life. When she spoke, her voice was both near and far. "Do you hear them?" Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the ground benes. Earth them trembled. From the darkness came a low moan, distant, buried, but unmistakable. He staggered back as a faint orange light pulsed beneath the earth, spreading outward in veins like fire under glass. Then the voice came again. This time it wasn't hers. It was many. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Men, women, children. Their words overlapping, rising, then fading to one whisper that filled the air like smoke. "Remember us." Samuel screamed. When his partner found him at dawn, Samuel was standing barefoot in the ashes of the ruin, staring blankly into the mist. His hair had gone grey overnight. He spoke only one sentence before he was taken to the hospital in Natchez. "They're still here," he said. "All of them." He never recovered. The doctors said he suffered from exposure and shock, but those who examined the photographs he'd taken that night never forgot what they saw. One frame, just one, showed the silhouette of a woman standing among the ruins, light spilling from the ground around her. And on the wall behind her, scrawled in ash, were 3 vertical lines. The mark of Isaiah Cole.
Magnolia Reach was never built upon again. The government rerouted the road, citing unstable soil, though no one ever explained what made the ground so warm, even in winter. Today the place is nothing but marsh and silence. But on humid nights when the air is thick and the trees are still, travelers on the old trace say they can smell magnolia and smoke. Some swear they hear a woman humming in the distance. Others claim to see a faint glow rising through the fog, like fire that refuses to die. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear it too. Not a haunting, not a curse, a truth that refused to be buried. Because evil can hide, but it cannot erase what it has done. Because justice, even when silenced, waits. And because some fires never go out. So the next time you pass an old field in Mississippi, where the air smells like something burned long ago, stop for a moment. Listen. You might just hear the echo of the voices that history tried to forget. If you believe stories like this should never fade, if you think the truth deserves to outlive the lies, then make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. Click the bell so you never miss another dark mystery that history tried to erase. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight?